Of all of the big swing moves that the Sacramento Kings could make this season that we've talked about over the past couple of weeks, this episode is probably the biggest. Ja Morant of the Memphis Grizzlies. Is he even remotely available? And what would it take for the Sacramento Kings to not just convince the Grizzlies to move on from Ja, but essentially convince the Grizzlies to rebuild? Joe Mullinax from the Locked On Grizzlies podcast joins me right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all offseason long. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports anchor, reporter for ABC 10 News. And over the past handful of weeks, we've had some fun exploring these big swing possibilities for the Sacramento Kings to, whether it's pursue or just keep their eye on, right? Names like Trae Young, names like LaMelo Ball, of guys that the Kings could go out and essentially bring into Sacramento to start a new era of Kings basketball, bring in a new star that also addresses their point guard needs. And Ja Morant is one of the names that I've heard discussed a lot here in Sacramento. I've seen it discussed on social media. I've actually seen Ja Morant's name be brought up in a lot of conversations from a lot of team fan bases and team media members of, is he available and could our team potentially go out and get him? Well, there are ways that I could talk myself into believing that the Memphis Grizzlies would be willing to move on from Ja Morant. But what about someone who's actually in Memphis who might be sick and tired of these conversations because they're completely unrealistic? So I thought, let's go get one of the Locked On Grizzlies hosts to come help give us some context on this conversation and also humor the conversation a little bit of like what kind of package, what absurd trade package it would take from the Sacramento Kings or any team to pry Ja Morant away from the Grizzlies. Joe Mullinax, nice enough to join me here on the show to humor that conversation. And, if you didn't want the Kings to overpay for anything in this offseason and any kind of trade, you're not going to be too thrilled with probably what it's going to take for the Kings to get Ja Morant. Here's my conversation with Joe. As we continue to look at different potential blockbuster swing moves for the Sacramento Kings, arguably the most blockbuster of them all has to do with Ja Morant and the Memphis Grizzlies. Is it a far-fetched fantasy idea, or is there a little possibility to these rumors outside of Memphis that Ja Morant could be available? Joe Mullinax from the Locked On Grizzlies podcast joins me right now to help us kind of figure this out and also humor us a little bit with what, in theory, it would cost to get Memphis to move on from their star point guard. Joe, I think a lot of people look at the late coaching change and Ja Morant's rumored feelings on that coaching change and are applying this belief that, hey, maybe the Memphis Grizzlies are going to want to move on from Ja. Now is the time for the Memphis Grizzlies to move on and try and maximize his potential trade value. But feet on the ground in Memphis, is Ja Morant even remotely available? Would the Grizzlies humor a phone call from the Kings or any team trying to throw a blockbuster package out there to take that star away?
First, thank you for having me. I appreciate you. It's always nice to be on another wonderful Locked On Podcast Network host show. On second thought, how dare you, sir, try to come into another small market and try to take away our superstar?
Just doing
okay.
my job.
How dare you? You had your chance with Luka Doncic, and you blew it.
Ooh.
You blew it years ago. Is what you did, and now you will
anti-Reese.
Yeah, absolutely. He literally was on your team, so you will take what you will get. You will get what you get. You will enjoy your Zach LaVine, and you will enjoy it.
Well,
take it and enjoy it. No, I'm sorry. In all seriousness, we live in a world where, not to mention Luka Doncic twice on a Kings podcast, we live in a world where he was traded, right, to a actual team after it was made clear that he's probably the best young player in the entire NBA. So is it possible that the Grizzlies would hear out a trade for Ja Morant? Yeah, it's possible. Is it probable? No. Is it something that's going to happen? I would say almost certainly not, for a couple of reasons. One of which being, I think Ja's value is probably low at this point in terms of the trade market. I don't know what team would be going head over heels to give up their future for a guy that has not played more than 60 games, I don't think, since his rookie season. So that is something to keep in mind, that while Ja Morant is electric, audacious, when he is right, he is one of the very best players in the entire league. I think that's fair to say. But when he's right, has a massive asterisk on it at this point. And I think that takes away from his value. Maybe not quite as much as Zion Williamson, but not far off in terms of those two big question marks. And another reason is he's simply the most talented player that has ever played for the Memphis Grizzlies. For Memphis to move on from this guy, it would have to be an overpay by Memphis fan standards. And I don't know if you've been exposed to Memphis Grizzlies fans too often, Matt. We have pretty high overpay standards. So I'm going to ask you here in a moment what you think your best offer is. Spoiler alert, it's almost certainly not good enough, because it's going to have to be something more than any logical person would pay for an undersized point guard who has not played very much over the last couple of seasons.
So what the Sacramento, for the concept or the perspective from the Kings and kind of the context of the Kings here, is the Kings are trying to kill as many birds with one stone as they possibly can. They traded away De'Aaron Fox, so they're in need of a new number one star. They went from having a boatload of point guards to no point guards. So they're desperately in need of someone to handle the basketball, regardless of if Zach LaVine's still on the team or if he's not. And the Sacramento Kings need somebody to bring the average age of the roster down, because 2 years ago, when the Beam team exploded onto the scene and the Kings made the playoffs, the Kings were one of the youngest, most exciting up-and-coming teams in the league. Now their average age is hovering around 30. They just traded themselves into an older version of the Chicago Bulls for reasons nobody logically understands, but here we are in Sacramento. So we're looking at different names of what could the Kings do this season if they are indeed trying to stick to this being as competitive as possible right now. They are not interested in a rebuild, at least from what we understand. What names out there potentially check those boxes? Ja Morant, of course. There was LaMelo Ball. There was Trae Young. And we've had conversations about both those guys as well with other Locked On hosts. But Ja was the one out of all of them. Even Zion was in there a little bit, although Ixnay, the point guard part. And now that Zion's doing his thing right now, maybe that conversation's a little bit dead. Tyrese Maxey, I suppose you could also put that in there too, but I don't know if Philly, maybe that's in the same level of Ja of Philly's not going to want to move on from him. When I put this out there, Ja was the name, and I put a vote out there for Kings fans of like, which one of these, if you could choose, like it was a schoolyard pick and you didn't have to worry about the price. Ja was the one that got the most votes, albeit not by a landslide or not by a very high amount, but Ja's the obvious one out of the group, and I feel the same way. In terms of best player, I think Ja is that guy. So this is, out of all the podcasts I'm doing, the ultimate home run swing that the Sacramento Kings can do. But again, as fun as these conversations are, and as much as they kill time for two teams that are not in the NBA Finals and still months away from the draft and training camp and whatever.
You're giving away our secrets.
Yeah, well, and the Kings don't have a draft pick too, so that's even worse.
Neither do the Grizzlies.
So here we are. So it's fun to kill time. It's fun. It's fun to kill time, but it's also like we're trying to figure out realistically what any team and either team could do. So that's where this Ja Morant conversation ultimately comes from. And the idea is, of course, Joe, that as we kind of sift into what that package would look like, the idea is that the Sacramento Kings, for any of these players, would have to throw something at these teams that's almost like you cannot possibly turn this down to make it happen. And we're just trying to find the lowest line of what that you can't turn this down is, essentially.
No, I understand that completely. And I do think, again, it's not impossible, it's improbable. Where the improbable comes in is I do think there's a lane. And I don't think the Grizzlies are ready to explore this lane yet. But I do think there is a multiverse out there where the Grizzlies rebuild. Because it's important to remember that Ja Morant was drafted in 2019, right? Like, we're talking about a team that has essentially been together as with the core of Ja, Jaren, and Desmond Bane for 5 years now. Like, Dez has been around for 5 full seasons, and they're still young, right? 25, 26. You hear the argument all the time comparing it to the Jays out in Boston and blowing it up too early and that sort of thing. But these 3 guys combined make over almost $1 billion, right, over the life of their contracts. And Jaren Jackson Jr. is about to be owed a lot of money. And you could pretty easily argue that right now the best player on the Memphis Grizzlies is not Ja Morant. It's Jaren Jackson Jr. So I think that there's a lane where if we're talking about a rebuild, a trade of Ja makes sense. I don't know that I would trade Ja and then keep Jaren. I think you just go ahead and completely punt. The Grizzlies have control of all of their own drafts moving forward after this one, after paying to get off of the Marcus Smart salary. They can pretty easily rebuild. The major question is going to be how that pathway kind of coincides and coexists with their desire to contend. And Memphis is not a city that's really going to take to rebuilding all that kindly, especially when you consider the reality of this being the most talented team in Grizzlies history. That's going to be a bitter pill to swallow for Grizzlies fans.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by Open Phone. If you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money that's left on the table. Think about the last time that you had an urgent need, maybe for a plumber or a service provider. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait? Probably not. You moved on. That's why you need Open Phone. Open Phone is the #1 business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. Open Phone lets you manage business calls and texts from a single app. The shared inbox feature is a game changer. Your team can jump into any conversation instantly without missing a beat. And their AI agent handles after-hour phone calls, answering common questions and capturing leads, so you never miss a customer, no matter what time of day it is. Open Phone is offering listeners 20% off, of your first 6 months at openphone.com/LockedOnNBA. That's OPENPHONE.com/LockedOnNBA. And if you have any existing numbers with another service, Open Phone will port them over at no extra charge. Open Phone, no missed calls, no missed customers. I'm glad you brought that up, because that was the hiccup that I had when I was just thinking about this in my own mind, is how do you convince a team that is further along than you in the goal you're trying to accomplish? How do you convince that team to step behind you willingly by giving you one of their star players? Like, the Memphis Grizzlies are further along in the established playoff conversation in the West and closer to actual contention in the West than the Sacramento Kings are.
Halfway through the regular season, the Grizzlies were the #2 seed in the Western Conference. We were talking about Jaren Jackson Jr. as a second-team All-NBA guy.
So why would the Grizzlies even consider going a rebuild route at this point without at least giving it one more year of, hey, maybe Ja can play 70-plus games?
Well, I know you follow the league pretty closely. There's this whole second apron thing that clearly has a bunch of teams terrorized, and Memphis is the 51st market in the NBA in terms of size, or 51st market in the country, I should say, in terms of size. The Grizzlies have never, not once, paid the luxury tax. They might have been in it for a minute and then made a trade or a waiving of a contract to get out of it. There's financial implications to this, and there's also team building implications. It's hard for those that have followed the team a while, like me, to believe that they're going to pay the luxury tax for a bad basketball team. And I do think that is the key context. I could easily see them going into this coming season and saying, all right, let's see what Tuomas Isalo, the new head coach, can do. We have Ja, we have Jaren, we have Dez. We have two really good young players and Jalen Wells, Zach Edey coming out of their strong rookie campaigns. Let's see what we can do with these guys and piece some mid-level exception signing here. They have tradable contracts like John Conchar, Brandon Clark may be there. There's ways that they can improve this roster on the margins and see what they can do this coming season. Trade deadline comes around. You are 25-24. What are we talking about, right? Are you really going to be willing to go into the luxury tax for a team that is going to once again be in the play-in? I think the answer for the Memphis front office and especially ownership is probably going to be no. At least historically, that's what it says. So I think this would be a more realistic conversation in the winter when the Grizzlies can still get out of whatever their financial straits might be. And it is important to point out that that Marcus Smart trade that they paid that 2025 first for, that allows for us to have a conversation where they don't have to worry about the luxury tax or any second apron issues beyond the tax for some time. They have a lot of money they'd have to spend between now and then, and that doesn't look probable at this stage. Memphis hasn't really been a free agency destination or focus for this front office since they've gotten into the mix.
Sacramento Kings can definitely relate to the free agency issues. And look, Sacramento has also never, ever paid the luxury tax. So there's some understanding here. And while the Kings have a little bit more financial flexibility and wiggle room than the Memphis Grizzlies might have, we're not talking enough to absorb the vast majority of Ja Morant's salary and free up a massive amount of cap space for the Memphis Grizzlies here. So already we're running into a hiccup before we even start talking about draft picks and putting draft picks on the table, as the Kings are paying nearly $50 million to Zach LaVine. The Kings are paying now over $40 million, $43 million a year. Right now, it's going to get even more to Domantas Sabonis. So these are not two contracts that are more expensive than Ja Morant that Memphis is even going to remotely consider, right? So take those off the table, which they've always kind of been off the table. Unless, I mean, you can surprise me and say, no, we'd be interested in Domantas Sabonis. I don't know why you
I think Memphis would be more interested in Sabonis than they would be LaVine at this stage. But again, with Edey on a rookie contract, with Wells on a rookie contract, when you actually sit down and look at the structure of this Grizzlies roster, it doesn't make sense for them to do anything other than retool around the three stars that they have, Ja, Jaren, and Desmond Bane, or completely blow it to hell, right? And just completely start over. In my sick, twisted mind, those are the things that make the most sense. I don't think it makes sense to trade a Ja for a Zach LaVine. I don't think that it necessarily makes sense for them to go and take Jaren and try to turn it into a Sabonis, although that would be an interesting conversation. I do think that there's a lane outside of the Kings where if Giannis really wanted to get out of Milwaukee and didn't care where he went, if Milwaukee wants to remain competitive and financially solvent, Bane and Jaren for Giannis, and that's kind of the baseline, is an interesting package, right? Now, again, there's a lot of floor spacing questions that need to be answered there. But the Grizzlies are in a tough spot, not necessarily in terms of lacking flexibility, but in terms of they can't go and they've put themselves in a spot where they've got these three guys and they have to try to build around them before they do anything else. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to trade one, at least to me, unless you're taking a Desmond Bane and you're trying to acquire a couple of starters outside of that just to supplement and build depth. But the Grizzlies, theoretically, don't need any more depth, right? They played 11 guys deep during a regular season where they were at times the number 2 seed in the Western Conference. So there's just so many different lanes that they can take that it can really, maybe the Kings are a realistic partner because they have the capacity to do deals with just about anybody.
Let me ask you this. If, given the circumstance or given the situation of the Grizzlies, the Kings could financially, it would work out. In fact, actually, the issue is here that the Grizzlies would take on a little bit more money if it's a 2-player for 1-player swap. So there might have to be another Grizzly thrown in there just to make the money a little more even.
I'll give you John Conchar.
Whatever it is. And we don't have to get too far in the weeds here, but for the Kings
I just can't stand John Conchar. But anyway, go ahead.
For the Kings to make the finances work, how much does Malik Monk and DeMar DeRozan even remotely, again, we're not even talking draft picks yet. We're talking a lot of draft picks thrown on here too, and we'll get to that. But to make the money work, a Malik Monk, DeMar DeRozan, DeMar, his final year of his contract is partially guaranteed beyond this year. He's owed $24 million. So you can ride it out for this year as kind of a mercenary-esque type score next to Desmond Bane, see how it works. Malik Monk is a 6th man of the year candidate if you bring him in off the bench, a ball handler that can replace not nearly all, but some of what Ja Morant does. I mean, that's a way that the Kings get there financially without including these massive contracts that we just talked about in Levine and Domantas Sabonis. With draft compensation on top of that, is that something you think, or even you, forget the Grizzlies, you even remotely go, yeah, those two players could be something that might interest or work here in Memphis?
It would probably require 3 additional firsts and whoever you think your best prospect is. And I think that's the reality of it. Is Ja is the Grizzlies' best chance at having a superstar. That's period, point blank. He has lots of baggage. He's done lots of things not lots of things. He's done some things off the court. He has obviously physically not been able to withstand the hammering of an NBA season. That was the issue this past campaign. But he's still their best shot, right? And he is somebody that in reality probably needs to be the second best player on a championship contending team, which is why I think that Giannis trade that I mentioned earlier would be so interesting. But I do think that it would take a heck of a lot on top of that in order for it to be worth the Grizzlies' while. And it probably would come down to, oh, okay, that's interesting that you think he's worth that much. Have a great day, right? And you kind of move on from that conversation after that.
This episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is also brought to you by BetterHelp. Let's talk about something that doesn't get talked enough about. We're talking about men's mental health. There's this pressure to always keep it together, right? To perform, provide, and never show weakness. But the truth is, real strength comes from opening up and taking care of your mental well-being. Every year, 6 million men in the United States experience depression and may go undiagnosed, but talking to someone, a friend, a loved one, or a therapist can make a huge difference. This is not just me reading off an advertising sponsorship. This is real for me, right? I have dealt with depression. I have dealt with anxiety. I've been seeing my therapist for 5 or so years now, TJ, and it has quite literally changed my life. Not that therapists have all the answers to everything, but what I encourage when I encourage people to talk to therapists, the best things that I can say about what therapy does for you is number one, it helps you unpack and understand what you're going through or struggles that you have in your life to any capacity, whether it's a grief from a massive loss or some smaller scale things that people might think don't require therapy or don't need to be talked about. And then it helps you build the life skills to be able to handle those things as life continues to throw them at you on a daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly basis. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off of their first month at betterhelp.com/lockedonnba. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. It's interesting you say the team's best prospect, because that's the Kings have 2 really good quote unquote prospects that are financially in different kind of situations. There's Keegan Murray, who's going into the final year of his rookie scale deal, paid only $11 million a year, but he's staring an extension right in the face. Does Memphis want to deal with those negotiations? And then there's Keon Ellis, who is a stupid steal of a deal, paid $2.4 million next year, but that's on a team option. If the Kings exercise that option, he then would become a unrestricted free agent the next year. If they don't exercise that option, he's a restricted free agent like this year. So both of these guys are not, there's not a long-term contract set up here, but those are 2 prospects that the Kings in a Ja Morant trade could probably be talked into being included. I don't know if you're getting Keegan, DeMar, and Malik off of the hands of the Sacramento Kings, but the draft pick thing is interesting because You said 3 first-round picks. It's funny. That was the number that I had in my head of like, you need to put 3 first-round picks on the table to even start this conversation. And if nothing else, the Kings have a lot of draft compensation. They have all their first-round picks through 2032, I believe, and they have a San Antonio Spurs unprotected pick and a Minnesota Timberwolves unprotected pick on top of that. This is the treasure trove where if you're going to make a team go, oof, like we really have to consider this, this is where you do it. I don't know if you go full on Rudy Gobert trade to Minnesota of all the picks that Minnesota gave Utah in that deal, but this is where the Sacramento Kings make any team at least have to pause and think about it. So if the Kings threw 4 first-round picks out there, regardless of the other pieces that are coming back to make the salary work, is that enough for Memphis to actually strongly consider, or does it have to even be more than that in your mind?
It probably needs to be more than that because they still think that they can contend, right? And through the lens of a rebuild, I'd probably do it. Because again, I'm not making the trade that you just outlined with the thought of being competitive in mind. That's not where my mind is. That's not what I'm thinking. I am doing this because I want to go full OKC. I want to go full process. I want to Presti this thing. I want to push the realistic ends of Memphis Grizzlies fandom. Jaren Jackson Jr. is not going to be around. Desmond Bane's not going to be around. Like, we're completely resetting this thing. And I want all that draft capital, either A, to just rebuild my talent stock, or B, to be able to do exactly what the Thunder can do every year until the end of time, it feels like, and go and be in the mix on all these different players because they have the financial ability and the trade capital to do so. So if you're going to try to be like OKC, to me, if that was the goal, which I don't think it is in reality, but in this hypothetical, I think that the Grizzlies would listen to a 4-pick, make it work financially beyond that, including some of those unprotecteds you just mentioned, because those could be golden tickets. Those could be lotteries. Those could be opportunities for you to really jump up, because who knows what's going to happen, right? 3 years ago, ESPN had proclaimed Ja Morant the next face of American basketball, and they were having Memphis Grizzlies days all over ESPN, right? It was the Grizzlies that were the Thunder before the Thunder were the Thunder. And now look at where the Grizzlies are. We're having a conversation where it's not that far outstretched to think that they might be a year or two away from moving on from this era entirely. So who knows what's going to happen? Having those assets would be valuable if you know in the here and now you aren't going to be able to compete and you don't want to pay to try.
Joe, let me ask you this. Put yourself in the shoes of the Sacramento Kings. Is Ja Morant worth, given all the things off the court, the amazing player that he is on the court, the injury issues and things like that, is Ja Morant worth, you think, completely, not necessarily punting your future, but mortgaging your future and going all in for a Ja Morant? Is that, knowing what you know about Ja, is that worth it for the Kings or any team in your mind? Would you do that if you were in another general manager's shoes?
If you did the trade that you just suggested, or at least the outline of it, would Ja Morant be expected to be the best player on the Sacramento Kings?
Yes.
Then no, it's not worth it. I would not do that trade because I do not know in my heart of hearts now that Ja Morant can be the best player on a championship contending team. And that's the kind of deal that you're making there, right? You don't have Anthony Edwards. Let's go back to the Gobert trade. If you have somebody like Anthony Edwards and you think this is the top 10 guy in the league that can be an alpha on a championship contender, which he's been in the Western Conference Finals the last 2 years. Like, if you're not contending for a championship in that role, what are we talking about? Right? So I think it's fair to say he is that guy. If you've got that guy and you think Gobert is that missing piece, we'll go over. Who cares who you're overpaying for if it completes the championship puzzle, right? I don't know that Ja is that guy. And if you don't already have that guy on the roster, like the Lakers have Luka, right? Go pay whoever you need to pay to bring in a center that fits off of Luka. It doesn't matter anymore, right? That kind of guy changes the calculus. I don't think the Grizzlies have that guy anymore. I would love to be wrong. As the host of Locked On Grizzlies, I'd love for Ja to be that guy. But he hasn't necessarily shown the ability to stay on the court, and he hasn't shown the growth in his game. Like, Ja's been in the league since 2019. We haven't seen growth in his three-point shooting. We haven't seen growth in his mid-range game. We haven't seen consistent improvement in terms of turnover rate. Like, that's where the gap between him and Halliburton is the most clear, is how much better of a creator of offense for others while protecting possessions Halliburton is than Ja. So there's so many players that have cleared him at this point. An offer like that would be hard for Memphis to turn down simply because that concern gets passed off to the next group. But I do want to stress, I don't think the Grizzlies trade Ja Morant because he is their best bet, their clearest path to being that contender that they so desperately want to be. I just have my questions about whether or not that's not necessarily the right choice because they don't really have another option, but whether or not it's correct, right? That he has to be on the court for us to see it.
Well, my takeaway from this conversation is that the Sacramento Kings would have to put such a lucrative offer on the table that it would have to give Memphis another option or ultimately convince Memphis. The Kings would have to put such a deal on the table with so many prospects that it convinces the Memphis Grizzlies to rebuild, which is pretty difficult for any team to do, especially in the Western Conference. Joe, appreciate you humoring the conversation. Appreciate you coming on, having some fun with it. I don't think this move is going to happen. I never thought this move was going to happen, but it's always fun, kind of off-season jargon to talk about whenever there's a team that's potentially star hunting like the Sacramento Kings. So I appreciate you, my friend.
When it's your team every day, sometimes you're going to talk about things that probably aren't going to happen. But you know what? We had fun. I had a good conversation. Thanks for having me on.